This particular breakout is about the project end of life, repowering and decommissioning, which we haven't had to do a lot of to date, but it's going to start happening. My name is Lon Rochester. I'm with Nelson Industrial Construction Engineering, and we have a wholly owned division called Nelson Wind. And what we do in this industry is we build the foundations, the concrete and rebar foundations for the wind turbines out there. Not all of them, but some of them, quite a few. We've done over 3,600 foundations around the country and up in Canada, providing over 7,600 megawatts of power, and on wind farms up to 150 turbines. And it just a curiosity. A lot of people will say, well, how big are those foundations? Well, some of them can be up to 700 cubic yards of concrete and 50 tons of rebar in one. So it's quite a process. So today we have two distinguished panelists with us. I didn't say extinguished, I said distinguished. The first that I'm going to bring up is Andrew Ross, Director of Retail Utility Services and Member Relations at NMPP Energy. Andrew assumed the role of Director of Retail Utility Services and Member Relations in April of 2015. He's been with NMPP Energy since 2008 with roles in resource planning, engineering services, and manager of engineering. He previously worked for the Nebraska Public Power District as a transmission and distribution engineer, where he designed and managed substation projects. Andrew has worked with more than 100 utilities spanning 5 states on issues ranging from wholesale power supply agreements to financial and engineering analysis for municipal governing bodies. And with that, I give you Andrew Ross.
Yes. Thank you, Lon. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate the time and opportunity to be here. As you can see, I'm not Shannon Coleman. She is unable to do this presentation, but I should be able to fill in. I did hold a role very similar to her with the Municipal Energy Agency in Nebraska prior, so I know a little bit about this project. So just to kind of set up a little bit before I go through the obligatory who we are and what we serve, I really just want to go through kind of the presentation, what we're talking about here. And this is from a utility perspective. So I know there's a lot of landowners in the room. I know there's vendors and other utilities. So this is a utility perspective of kind of looking at a wind farm towards the tail end of the life. You know, we're installing a lot of wind turbines. We're installing a lot of renewable generation across our grid. But this is a very early project that we get to see kind of the end of life and some of the decisions that came out of that from the utility perspective. So Municipal Energy Agency of Nebraska, which is a segment of NMPP Energy, is a wholesale-only utility that covers 4 states. We've recently added Center Colorado, which now means we serve over half the municipals in the state of Colorado. None of the big ones, Boulder, Pueblo, those, but we do have a presence out in Colorado, a couple in Wyoming, and about 10 in Iowa. But started in Nebraska, like I said, wholesale only, and we're going to be talking about, if you can see Kimball, and for those who know where Kimball is or don't know, it's off way close to the Wyoming border there on Nebraska, and that's what the project I'm going to be talking about. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Quick go through. We established in 1981. We're a joint action agency, a political subdivision of the state of Nebraska, wholesale power provider for NMPP Energy. We have 68 participants that I showed you. 61 of them are total requirements participants outside of their Western allocation. And we operate in Southwest Power Pool, MISO, and still have bilateral markets that we deal with in the West, in Colorado, Western Nebraska, and Wyoming. And you can see we have a vast, we have coal, wind, hydro, WAPA. We offtake some nuclear from NPPD, and so we have a wide mix similar to a lot of utilities across the region. And we are transmission dependent. We own a little piece of transmission over by Walter Scott 4, but other than that, we are completely transmission dependent. Okay, so Dave and I might argue about this a little bit, but I'm claiming this as the first wind farm built in Nebraska. It was 3 miles northwest of Kimball, and this was in 2001 was when we started construction, made the decisions. 2002 was the commercial operation date. So this was a 7 turbines, 1.5 megawatts each, Vestas, that gave us 10.5 megawatts. We did pay cash for this and did had an O&M agreement with a third-party contractor. So this was not a PPA. This was early. We actually bought this facility, bought the turbines, and had a O&M agreement with a third-party vendor that I'll kind of go through as we go. But you can see this was all the way back in 01, 02. So this was very, very early in the wind generation. We had one landowner, and we interconnected to the Kimball substation, which then took it to Awapa, a western substation on their transmission. Okay, so this gets a little engineering into it, but the bottom line is let me see if I can find my pointer. Which one's the pointer? That's not the pointer. All right, here we go. So these are the 7 turbines here, and I didn't put numbers on here, but I'll just tell you this is about 40% here. So each of the turbines, the blue represents the output in 2011 to 14. So each turbine, you can see the blue representing that, and then you can see we started having serious downgrades and problems about 13, 14 years into the project. So you can see each turbine from the blue to the orange is dropping in production, as well as we had some major repairs going on. I'll show you in a different slide. 17 generator replacements, 4 gearbox replacements, and we started having quite a bit of failures in that 15 to 16 time frame. Same thing here. You can see that capacity factor, once we hit about 13, 14 years, we really start to plummet in some of the output of those generators. We have costs here. This was our administrative costs over the life of the project here. You can see insurance costs actually even decrease in this blue line. Yellow, the wheeling stays pretty standard, and our lease isn't much over the time period. You can clearly see what the real big hit to mean was the fixed O&M represented in orange. So what happened is we kept having problems with the generators, and so our fixed contract that we paid through the third-party contractor kept going up because they kept having to do more and more work. So you can see in the orange our fixed O&M, and in the gray even a little bit of the variable O&M increasing along with the downgrade in output. Obviously, from a business perspective, now we have to make a decision on this facility. We also had some legal limitations. We don't, as a public power utility, the PTCs, we don't have that option, and we were also given a board opinion that MEAN cannot directly sell operating generation assets to a private for-profit entity operating in the electric industry. So this was something MEAN had to really deal with internally. And so we went out for a RFP and did we were looking for a 20-year power purchase agreement. Keep in mind, when we buy these 7 turbines, we did not have decommissioning included in any of our PPA agreements because we didn't have a PPA agreement. So the decommissioning had fallen on us to figure out, and so we put it in the contract for somebody else to figure out as well, the decommissioning included. We are wholesale only. We don't have a construction outfit. So we had to look for someone to take this all the way. And we looked at three different options. We looked at wind and solar, we looked at just decommissioning, and then we looked at repowering as well. What we decided, we did some analysis here, and again, not keeping numbers, but I'll just kind of go through. So this is the cumulative cost, our analysis of the combination of West resources and market. So if the generator is not generating, then we have to back that up with market purchases. So we can see this middle line here is the decommissioning costs, what we planned on. Okay, now we don't have 10.5 megawatts out there. We have to replace that power. Green was, let's just patch it up. Let's fix it. Let's put new gearboxes and keep down that path. And the blue was the PPA, the repowering of the PPA. So that's the one that we chose. We had a decommissioning contract with NGC, New Generation Construction, locally owned here. And in some discussions with Justin Hernandez, who I know, they took a lot of this material. A lot of this material is recyclable. And actually a lot of it, I believe, was shipped off to China. So a lot of the material was sent on to China. Here you can see the tearing down of the facilities. Nobody really knew how to do this. We had kind of looked at, everybody knows how to, and they probably do now, but everybody knew how to kind of put these things up. But you don't just push these things over. I mean, you have to have some kind of process to do this. And for those who know, you talked about foundations. These foundations go very deep. They go past the groundwater table, and there's a lot of considerations there. Luckily, since this was such an early project, we actually were grandfathered in. We did not have to remove the entire substructure. We had to remove quite a bit of it and then kind of repurpose the land. But since this was way back in 01 and 02, we were not under the new rules, which I believe now say that you have to remove the entire substructure. No, Dave? Oh, it's not passed yet. Okay, so it's out there. So they're considering that. Well, we did not have to do that in this case, which was nice. But you can see removed the below ground structures to ground level, foundations, there's distribution conduit. So there's a lot of work here when you have to go through this. And I think this project really, for one perspective, some of the decisions that go into this, but also, thinking about all this renewable generation on the backside, all right? And so we've kind of learned now that the PPA structure, first off, is better for utilities such as ourselves. And we also found that it's very good to establish decommissioning in that contract. So there is a plan. I work with a lot of utilities that have a wind generator that came in because maybe it was a small one for a school project or something behind the meter. And what happens is the person who installs that then can't be found 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So you have to have some intellectual property. You have to understand what to do with these things as they reach the tail end of their life. Now, capacity factors have increased, technology has increased, but these things will still eventually wear out and become financially obtuse, if you will. So this is the PPA we went with. It was 12 turbines, but these were larger. Instead of 1.5 megawatts, they were 2.5 megawatts each. GE turbines. They had an 80-meter hub height, 116-meter rotor diameter for the engineering nerds in the room, and 20 years of length. It was a PTC included, an energy-only price. And for the landowners in the room, the original 7 turbines were on one landowner. This actually expanded to 7 different landowners that we put these on. So we used a very similar site, same kind of interconnection, WAPA transmission system, and we had some guarantees in the contract for availability and annual generation. We can curtail, but we have to pay to curtail, and decommissioning is included in the contract. So I think that might be standard now in PPA structures, but there are a few things you should always think about as you do these PPAs. You should think about decommissioning, and you should definitely think about losses. Losses can always be an issue when you do a project such as this. So we went from 10.5 megawatts as the first wind farm in Nebraska in Kimball, 10.5 total to 30, and we were proud of the way it worked out. And so the official decommissioning date of that facility was October 30 in 2017. Kind of proud to say that we had commercial operation inside of 1 year on June 29, 2018. And as you saw before, if I went back to that slide, how am I doing on time? Okay. If I go back to this is risky here. It doesn't like this slide. So you can see here, I can tell you that, where I'll go here on the capacity factor, this red line here. So down here, this is 20%. So you're looking at in 15, 16, we're now at about 23% capacity factor on that facility. And if I fast forward on the new 30 megawatts, obviously they're new, but we have some initial output of 43.5% now on the annual capacity factor. So again, good things to know on the decommissioning side, some of the decisions that we had to go through on something at the end of life, since so much of the renewable industry is kind of in getting these things out there, right? Get these things installed, get these things tied into the grid, which is a good thing. But same with solar too. I'm sure Dave's going to rope me into a solar decommissioning at some point. But you know, we got to think about these solar panels too. What are we going to do at the end of those life? You know, when those are in 20, 25 years, there are some recyclable things to think about. There's some chemicals in there. We've got to have a good plan for when these things turn over. Just like our civil infrastructure on our transportation system, on our transmission system, we're rebuilding our transmission and roads and things like that. The renewable generation's the same way. You saw all the decommissioning stuff that comes out of OPPD with their nuclear plant. So it's a different animal, but it's still something you absolutely need to think about as you go through a project, on the front end, in the middle, and then at the end.
Yeah, so, thank you very much. We'll hold all your questions until Will gets completed. Will, I'm going to introduce you, tell them how smart you are here in just a second. I'm now going to introduce Will Kirby, who's a renewable energy project manager for the employee-owned consulting firm HDR, based out of Omaha. Will is a professional civil engineer experienced in the design of renewable energy and interconnective projects. Will manages design teams and projects related to solar energy, wind energy, battery storage, and interconnection systems around the country. He also has a background in sustainability efforts for HDR and his clients. I present to you Will Kirby.
All right. Oh, no, it's good. Right there. All right, good afternoon, and thank you, Lon, for the introduction. You didn't have to lie too much, I don't think, so thank you. Thank you also to the audience, the hardy souls that stuck it out through the entire conference. Appreciate you guys hanging around, and hopefully you've enjoyed this conference. I think it's fitting that decommissioning and repowering go last. It's considering we're the end of life. I don't know if they necessarily save the best for last, but end of life is probably more fitting. So why this presentation? As Lon mentioned, I do have an interest in sustainability and end of life. So while all of the renewable growth is great, there are other considerations we need to take into account. So it started also for me with questions. My previous background was in transmission line design, about 9 years before shifting to renewable energy a year and a half ago with HDR. So when you're thinking about high voltage transmission lines, you're not necessarily asking the same questions about end of life. You're not thinking about where those suckers are going to be in 20, 40 years. Hopefully they're still standing and that they're going to stand for another 20, 40, 50 years. But solar and wind projects is a little different story. You get into that 20, 30-year range or even less, as Andrew demonstrated. You start to ask those questions about what's going to happen at end of life. There we go. So questions. So just starting with questions, not finishing with questions. I had to figure out, what questions did I have about end of life for projects. So some of them that came across for me: who requires decommissioning specifically in Nebraska? What are their requirements? Andrew, you're right. This thing is touchy. What's the process? What's the actual decommissioning process? Who has to pay for it? And where can solar and wind equipment and components be recycled? So these are some of the questions that I've had, and I know many of you in the room probably have similar questions or additional questions. We'll try to address those throughout the presentation, and if there's any others at the end, we can handle them then. So quick overview, Q and not A. Then we'll dig into the rise of wind and solar and everything that comes along with it, not just what we view as the important growth. What about decommissioning policy in Nebraska, both at the state level and what's behind it? Then we will jump into actual decommissioning processes, and we'll have some decommissioning considerations and takeaways at the end. So I think we've seen a million variations of these graphs throughout the conference. We see the renewables rising, and more importantly, we see different types of renewables starting to rise, solar soon overtaking wind in the coming decade, most likely. So we need to understand what are the differences between end of life for these types of projects. So solar, incredible growth, exponential growth as we've seen. I want to look at this graph that we've seen throughout the conference in a different way, into millions of panels. So it's a pretty impressive graph. Yes, even last year, I think this is about 34 million panels installed just in that single year, if we're considering average panel wattage. And so in this last 5 years, we're going to have 185 million panels to deal with in approximately year 2040, 45. So it's a lot of volume of panels to consider. So there are a lot of positive benefits to reducing carbon and everything else that comes with solar, but we also need to understand what we're going to do with, I'm going to call it a waste, because as of right now, federally or state speaking, you do not have a requirement to recycle solar panels. So we shouldn't be treating this as waste. We should be treating it as a resource, but that's a different conversation. So we've seen this map. It's in the back of your handout, the solar facilities in the state of Nebraska. Nothing to exactly blow you away compared to some of the other states. So 24 megawatts approximately, about 80,000 panels. Not much all in all. But even with recent announcements about upcoming projects, OPPD, Salt Creek Solar, you see that we could quickly dwarf that and get into the millions of panels just with installations in the next few years. Okay, so where nationally is solar being installed? Well, a lot of the typical states that we see, Southwest, Southeast is growing a lot, even East Coast. In terms of where are the recycling facilities, you can see they are scattered around the nation. The filled-in stars represent facilities that can handle the entire panel, while the white stars represent facilities that can only handle certain components. So when you're talking about recycling thousands or millions of panels, where those recycling facilities are becomes important, becomes a very important cost component. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So now switching back to that wind map that's in your handout, we have a little bit more mature industry in the state of Nebraska, about 2 gigawatts installed and using an average turbine size about 1,300 turbines. So again, it doesn't seem like an overwhelming number, but you think about 1,300 turbines, the size and scope that Andrew described in his presentation, it's a lot to consider. And where can wind turbines be recycled? Well, the good thing is the majority of those components in the turbine are recyclable. You have a lot of steel, and between conduit and other materials, you have probably places in almost any state or region that could handle those components to recycle. However, there are fiberglass components in the turbine blades and in the nacelle that is a little more challenging. I had recently come across an article about a company based out of Washington that does recycle the fiberglass, or probably more accurately, it downcycles it into fiberglass pellets that can be used in other industries. And so they have a facility in Texas, and I think they might be expanding, but you can see there's only 2 locations, and we have wind projects scattered all around the U.S., and specifically near us, there's nothing very close. So the costs to ship those blades or other components back to somewhere else might make things cost prohibitive. Okay, so let's get into the decommissioning policy and drivers. Who or what requires decommissioning and what's driving it? So starting off with solar, this is a state view. It's a pretty blank map, and I don't know if the colors are showing better for you than me. But it's the state of Nebraska. Oh, man. Well, I know for a fact that on the computer, Nebraska is filled in, as are a couple other states, so I'm not sure what the projector colors are doing. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty bare map. not many states have state-level decommissioning policy requirements. Nebraska is one of them, which I was a little surprised. And I don't want to get too word-heavy on this, so I tried to pull out some highlights. It's not necessarily a long policy, but it does a few important things. So first off, it requires the applicant to submit a decommissioning plan, step one. And it has to be the owner or the applicant of that facility. It defines when it has to be decommissioned, it establishes when the decommissioning security, the financial security, has to be posted, what that is for, and that it's the owner who is solely responsible for the decommissioning. So as Andrew stated, all those considerations, even when you're talking about a PPA, are crucial. Then it also, importantly at the end, states that if you are in a local jurisdiction that has already enacted decommissioning requirements, it defers to those. So now looking at the wind decommissioning map, so this isn't truly the states that require it, but this is the siting authority. So the states in yellow are state siting requirement states, and then blue it's split between state and local. So between the blue and the yellow, you do have more state requirements, but as we'll see, a lot of those are filtered down to the local level. So the Nebraska State Wind Decommissioning Policy, very similar. It requires that it must be done. It requires that if there is a local government entity that has adopted requirements, that it filters down to that. And also you must submit a decommissioning plan to the board, and that you must bear all the costs of decommissioning. And again, it says the security or bond for decommissioning must be posted no later than the 10th year. And for good measure, the state says, hey, we can take action on this if you don't comply. And that you must also comply with any local government requirements. So when it comes to decommissioning, the state does have a say, and it's kind of the catch-all. But when it does come to decommissioning, it's best to think local. A lot of things are going to be driven at the local level. The conditional use permit or special use permit to actually make the project happen, the schedule for when it needs to be completed, cost assurances, sometimes waste and recycling, and other environmental protections are all going to filter down to the local level. So let's take a quick look at a couple local policies. Usually it's county-led, county commissioning or county zoning. So Pierce County is one I highlighted, but also even our host city of Lincoln decided to get in the fun. And usually you don't see that for cities because you think a lot of that happens outside of the cities. But Lincoln has a 3-mile jurisdictional line, I believe so. So they have their own large solar decommissioning and zoning requirements. So looking at Pierce, this is pretty simple all in all. But you have to it defines when you have to decommission after if the project's abandoned. So in this case, 12 consecutive months. It defines what you have to remove, and it also, again, importantly, establishes who has to pay for it. So again, the property shall be considered abandoned after 1 year of non-operation. And it also here defines how quickly it needs to be removed. So City of Lincoln, even simpler yet, says you have to have one, says what the procedure is, and who has to pay for it. Okay, switching to wind, looking at a couple different counties. Holt County, which we had some folks here from Holt County. I think I see one down here, so I'm reading his zoning ordinance. Hamilton County, also another county in Nebraska with defined wind ordinances. And what you see is that a lot of these are either the same or very similar. So this one's for Hamilton to start, but when I looked at some others in Antelope, Knox, Cherry County, all were exactly the same in this case. So to pull out a few highlights, discontinued or abandoned after a year of no production, it defines what needs to be removed and to the depth. So Andrew mentioned that. In this case, it's 4 feet below ground level. And it also defines the cost component again, who's paying for it. And importantly, with the cost estimate, what you are committing to pay for, it identifies who has to prepare that, a competent party, such as a professional engineer or contractor capable of decommissioning or with that experience. Okay, a couple other things to point out. Again, this is with Hamilton County. They do have some specific waste disposal requirements. These aren't necessarily tied into that main body of decommissioning, but they are still important to note for the project's duration. That means during the construction of the project, during the O&M phase, and during the end of life, you have to adhere to their requirements. And similarly with county roads, in this case, a pre-construction survey of the roads and bridges in the area, due to mostly all the construction traffic and large equipment, is required. So you consider that during the initial construction phase, but decommissioning is essentially another construction phase. So I would anticipate that same requirement to be met at the end of life of the project. Okay, yeah, Holt County. So here, at first glance, Holt County looked almost the exact same as those others, but in this case, they go to 5 feet below ground, and they have a shorter duration for when the wind turbines must be removed. So point being here is that even though things might seem similar, you still have to read the fine print and understand everything within the regulations. Okay, just working in this industry for a little while and having done some decommissioning plans and projects, I've heard some things that keep coming up that people should be aware of, either for wind or for solar. Some of them are financial assurance requirements, and those getting more specific. Estimates to that cost update on what the actual cost is going to be to decommission the project. What about land restoration? This is always very critical, and that ties right into erosion and environmental impacts during the project and after the project. Local landowner safety is always paramount, and as I said, decommissioning is just another construction phase, so this is important to consider throughout. And then noise and construction impacts, which decommissioning is another phase of construction. So you have to take in consideration all these things. So it is a lot to consider. It's fairly straightforward, but it's a lot to consider. So this is kind of a checklist that I've put together. A lot of these things we've already seen, but what are the defined conditions upon when it'll be initiated? Not just that end of life period, but maybe it's after abandonment or a period of non-production. The time frame for completion, is it 90 days? Is it 180 days? What are the plans for updating the actual plan throughout the life? Maybe regulations change or costs change. Who is responsible for that decommissioning? Is it the owner or is it someone else? Financial assurances for decommissioning costs. Again, very important. Whoops, a couple there. A description of any lease. So this is important. Sometimes there are decommissioning requirements or contractual agreements with landowners. So you need to be aware of all those, especially if you're coming into a project like Andrew was describing. Final electrical and or environmental inspection. This is going to vary county to county, but you need to be aware of what, after decommissioning, are there any electrical inspections that need to happen? Are there any environmental inspections that need to happen before or after? And then the actual removal of the equipment, and I said non-utility owned equipment there because you need to keep in mind with some of these larger projects, you might have co-located or shared assets with the utility if it's a privately developed project. So you need to be aware of the coordination aspect of that as well. And finally, the restoration of the property. 2 conditions prior to, I had solar development there, but solar or wind development, which in the agricultural setting, this is very important to return the land to be used for its previous purpose. So the actual process, I won't get into this too much because I think a contractor could do a great job or about the process in general, but it's essentially installation in reverse. So there are some pre-decommissioning activities that you need to take into account. Maybe it's coordination with the utility, de-energizing the site, and putting in place environmental protections. Once those are all in place, you get into the manpower-heavy activities such as starting to remove all the panels, removing piles, conduit, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a lot of logistics. This is a lot of people on site, and one thing you need to consider, too, is some of these materials might be recycled. Some may even be resold. So you need to understand what the end use is for the materials and make sure you're taking proper precautions. Once all that is done, fences and gates can be taken down, and the site can be regraded if needed. It might not need to be graded whatsoever, or and reseeded to restore the land. Okay, wind decommissioning. Again, installation reverse. One of the major differences, you're going to have very large equipment on site again. So you're going to have some of those same pre-decommissioning activities, but one of the things you need to keep in mind is that you're going to have that large equipment on site again, so you might have to go through those same surveys, inspections. You might have to prep for crane pads or anything else. So you need to be aware of that phase again. Turbine dismantling removal, again, not a simple process, so you're going to have those large cranes taking down the blades and the nacelle, and then the tower and the foundation, according to what your local ordinances are. And then you get into cable removal, and eventually the same process of restoring the roads and land restoration. In certain cases, you might work with the stakeholders, the local landowners, and see if they want to keep any of those roads, which I know sometimes is the case. So this slide advancer gets a little trigger happy. It already put out my answer to the test, but how much does it cost for solar? It completely depends on who you ask. So what I've presented here are some numbers from a study that I located from 2017. These are based on per megawatt costs. So you can see that's a huge swing for the cost to decommission solar. Max of $179K down to a net positive of $89K, and an average of about $57K for this study. So why that swing? Well, there's certainly significant costs associated with it, all that manpower, all that removal. Then there's also some disposal and recycling costs, and then the site restoration costs that can vary greatly depending if they have to do anything to restore the land. The salvage values, there is a lot that can be recycled. There's steel piles, there's steel or sometimes aluminum racking, electrical equipment that can be salvaged possibly from the substation and cabling and everything else. Panels, I have seen in some cases people trying to assume a salvage credit for the panels, but as Lee Corso says, not so fast, my friend. In my research, I've never seen, I'll have a caveat in a second, but I've never seen a salvage value for the panels. In fact, to recycle them, I've seen a cost of about 40 to 50 cents per pound for recycling panels. And I've reached out to some of those recycling facilities to get fairly accurate and recent numbers. The caveat is if there is a secondary market and if you have panels that are still possibly operating at a high capacity, those might be able to be resold, and thereby you could recoup some of that cost. So that is project dependent. That's why it's hard to give a firm cost. So wind, same boat. It can have a great variation, 222K per megawatt for a high in this same study, down to 2K per megawatt for a low, which probably had a great salvage value. It averaged about 51K per megawatt, or for the math geniuses out there, about 76K for an average 1.5 megawatt turbine. So again, not something that should be ignored, and depending on your project, it could be significantly more or less. That turbine dismantling and removal, obviously for wind, is the high cost. That equipment power, and then also the disposal and recycling of some of the components might have some significant costs as well as land restoration. Salvage values, steel, some of those components, the electrical components in the turbine itself, and then some of the associated collection system infrastructure could also have some salvage value. So why decommissioning financial assurance? Well, in a perfect world, everybody does what they're supposed to do and take care of the project, clean it up, get it out of there, get on their way. But we know things happen. Markets crash, companies go bankrupt, and local stakeholders and local governments need to protect their citizens, protect landowners. So the financial assurance piece is very important. How do they do that? Well, there's a few key ways. Most of what you'll see in Nebraska that I've seen, and probably nationwide, is the posting of a bond. It could be a security, surety, performance bond, and they're all slightly different, but essentially do the same thing. Letter of credit, promised by a financial institution. There's also guarantees and even traditional methods such as a check or even insurance policy. So a few decommissioning financing best practices to put forth. Sounds obvious, but know what you're going to pay for. Sometimes they ask for these early on, but it is important to understand what your project components actually are going to be and what you're going to pay for either in the actual end-of-life decommissioning process or in the bond period when you're putting forth the money to assure that it's going to get paid for. So updating costs. Decommissioning costs might change throughout the life of the project. That seems pretty reasonable. Also, more importantly, the salvage costs might change. There's a lot of market swings on some of these materials, so the value of these materials are going to change or could change drastically throughout the life. So I think it's important to update those costs periodically, and most importantly, towards the end of life. So discuss that assurance piece early with the county or whatever zoning ordinance you're working with and understand some of those nuances. It's pretty simple on paper, but actually getting to the details and who needs it, how they need it, and anything else is good to establish early on. And also seek clarity with all stakeholders. Maybe in some of these counties you have, whether it's big or small, you might have someone on the planning commission that's helping approve the project, and then you might have a county clerk or a treasurer that has other expectations. So understand all those requirements early on so there's no confusion. I've covered a lot, gone through quite a bit of material in a short amount of time, so I wanted to give you guys a few takeaways to take away from today. So renewables aren't slowing down. We've seen the graphs. Where they go from here is a little bit up for debate, but it's not necessarily going away. So we need to be prepared to address all of the impacts that are coming along with this explosive growth of renewables. Decommissioning is a relatively straightforward process. It's a fairly simple process on paper, but it's not the same everywhere. You need to think local. Start local and work your way up to your state to make sure that you're complying with all requirements. And while they are getting cheaper, as I said, the costs at end of life can be a significant part of the project, so you need to know what you're paying for, who pays for it, and when, and all the other details. These are all important factors to consider with your project, and I think some of Andrew's slides were very helpful in demonstrating some of those end-of-life costs, O&M, and other factors leading into the project decommissioning. So I want to thank you guys for your captive attention here, and I guess we'll do any questions.
Regarding the project in Kimball, I think it's important to know how early that was in the technology. So again, this was the first commercial wind farm in Nebraska, and that was 2001 or 2, and so it was about a good 12 or 13 years before we really started seeing the degradation. We saw increases on O&M, but with technology, they've not only gotten cheaper, but I think they've also hoped to. I mean, proof will be as we go on. But I think the newer technology should also last longer. Similar in the solar industry, when you saw inverters, early inverters tended to go bad more often as the energy was converted from DC power to AC. Those are starting to last a little bit longer as well. So technology is not only making these things cheaper, but they're also hopefully, and again, proof will be as we see as we go on, but they also last longer. I think the newer ones should have at least 20-year plus life, and so the 12 to 13 years we saw was really because we were one of the first ones out there. I'll let Will touch on the recyclable and salvage value.
Yeah, it certainly is a concern, and you might see solar projects in the 20, 25-year range as a kind of a standard. A lot of them have options to extend up to 40, and I think some wind projects do too. But there probably are going to be replacements that happen on those key components throughout the life. So that's why I see recycling improvement capabilities and the volume as a necessity to the growth of our industry, and I think it'll happen. I know a lot of the national organizations are devoting a lot of effort into improving our recycling capabilities, but yes, there are things that just have to get replaced so often, and technology gets greater. So while your technology might still work, there might be just a much more efficient product on the market, and it might make the economics of the project that much better. So that's something that you have to consider, and not just is the product still working.
It's a moving target.
Oh, I wanted to ask Andrew a question. What is wheeling?
The wheeling is regarding for the delivery of the electricity as we move it through a substation, through a transmission. We had I believe a line, a Kimball line that fed to a Western substation. I have somebody in the room probably knows this answer, but wheeling is just getting that power to commercial operation. Close enough, Billy? Thanks. I got a thumbs up, so I'm good.
Dave Roberts, Linn County Wind Association. One of the things I noticed that you do not have in any of the decommissioning was the time frame and financial funds that you side. And if I missed it, I'm sorry. But because of the way it's done in the state of Nebraska, most, if not all, wind farms that have been laid are constructed by local LLCs, which are funded by a company. The problem that I have had, and I've brought up many, many times, is that year 19 and a half, the LLC can just say, I quit. And if you don't have money put aside, and I don't care if the state law says substantial funds, define substantial funds. So, and now when I see that you also have a timeline of decommissioning has to be done within a year after the operational date has happened, you may not have anybody left, and now it's left to the landowner that owns that, that owns the land where this wind farm or solar farm is on. So we've got some holes in the law that does not, I missed something.
Yeah, I think for the state wind policy, I might have not read it. But it is required to post that security bond no later than 10th year of the project.
Security bond for how much?
The cost of the project.
How much?
You tell me what the cost of the project is.
It says substantial funds.
Yeah, it might say that somewhere else. That's not what I'm reading.
Cost of the project, okay, so still, it needs to be defined a little bit.
I have not seen in any of those wind ordinances or solar, I didn't see the word substantial anywhere. I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm saying what I saw didn't have it in there. Yeah.
So for those that are still looking at doing wind leases, to make sure that you have something in year 10 that you're starting to put the money aside, whether it's a letter of credit or what have you, because if you're 19,
yeah, and I will say that financial security, I don't get visibility to that a lot, and a lot of times that's handled with lawyers and behind the scenes, so I don't get to see all the details, but I know just, it's a simple paragraph or sentence on a requirement, but it is something that has to be, I don't want to say negotiated, but it has to be worked through each time. That's kind of why I put the bullet about seeking clarity early on, so counties or whoever else are making sure all those protections are in place before the project takes place. And at the end of the day, if something does happen to the company at year 19 of a 20-year project, I mean, the most important factor is probably that the money's there. So that's a protection.
The statement that you had that says the road to hell is paved through detention is very applicable in this state.
Yeah, and that's a good point to that. I just have a quick little side note to the related topic is I worked with a community in Northwest Colorado, and they had, about a decade ago, they put in a small wind generator for their school. And again, good intentions, sounded good, looked good, thing was turning for a few years. Well, 5 to 10 years down the road, it started having some problems, and the installers and outfit that put it in was nowhere to be found. Nobody had thought about anything with decommission, and now you've got this school that says, what am I going to do with this turbine now? So there's small, it's on a large scale and a small scale. And I could cite a few others that are similar to that. And I think your point is well taken as far as, you have to think about the project end of life as part of any contract.
And you will get the argument from the wind developers, well, you don't require this of anybody else that's building a building in the county, whether it's in a store or a hog plant or what have you, which is true, but most of this is on leased ground, and it's a different animal, so you cannot emphasize enough the decommissioning. It's almost as important as the very funding, if not more so. Because in 20 years, even you, as young as you guys are, you're not going to be here.
I hope I am.
Well, okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. That got ominous. That was that took end of life to another level there.
Any other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm certain that it's not the legislature's intent that the state, that any county in the state would be left with holes at the end of a contract and decommissioning isn't completely covered. So any local entity where you think that might be a problem, I encourage you to contact your senator to discuss that. And my question was whether there is any research or even anecdotal information about the effect of leaving all the equipment underground further than 4 or 5 feet.
Effect of leaving equipment or anything underground below 4 or 5 feet? Well, I mean, as you saw, I can't say a specific value on the depth of those foundations. Lon might even know, but they go beyond 4 or 5 feet. So I don't think concrete. I think it's a fairly inert substance once it's down there. Concrete and steel. So I don't know if there's any research on leaving it in the ground. I can tell you there's probably a lot of concrete in the ground around our state that we don't even know about. So as far as water supply or anything else, I don't think there's serious concerns, but I don't know about any research on that. Conduit or anything else, most of what was put in the ground is designed to be watertight and everything else. So if something like that gets left behind, I don't know if there's any other repercussions, and I don't know of any research into something like that. But I know it's designed to keep water out.
The 4 feet usually should take care of most of the non-concrete and steel. So I don't know how much other than that would be beyond 4 feet. And as a civil engineer, I don't know of anything that regarding steel and concrete at those depths. I mean, these foundations are built all the time, not just for wind turbines, but dead end structures on substation, transmission lines, piers for bridges. So, I mean, we stick concrete and steel in the ground all the time, constantly. But it is a good question. I don't know of anything regarding those substances that cause any problems, especially in the abandonment of the locations where they're at. But most of anything else is going to be covered with that 4 foot, and I think that's why they decided that.
That concludes the epistle for the day, and thank you all for coming.
Well, nice to meet you.